Welcome to the Beauties and Beasties podcast with Alex and Sean.
Hello.
Hello.
You got it right this time. Hey.
Well, listen, for anyone watching, I'm controlling the thingy, so if it goes terribly wrong, thoroughly expect it. Yeah. Why am I controlling the buttons tonight?
Because I am all the way over in sunny Denver, so I'm in a different time zone. I don't know which way's up, but I'm here for Pest World, which is been an absolutely phenomenal ride. It's been amazing, like having a chat to a lot of the pest managers out here, having a chat to a lot of the companies out here. I mean, for starters, I mentioned this to you just briefly off stage, but I've met the guys from Pest Posse in the flesh. I had a good chat and catch up with them, and I'll be going to see them this evening for a bit of a party. But I had no fewer than three of our international listeners come tap me on the shoulder today to say, or over the week, to say, hey, good luck with the pod, well done with the podcast. So it looks like our international viewership is taking some big. One of them was from Canada. So how about that?
Awesome. Tell you what, though, the one thing I'm going to say tonight, we have a young lady by the name of Florence who's come to join us, author, very interesting lady. She's got to be gone by 8:15. She's on a tight time scale. So rather than me, I'll talk. And I think if we get into the pest world, it's going to be long. So we'll leave that for next week. We'll touch down that again next week. We'll bring Florence straight in. And Florence, after 3, go. 1, 2, 3. Go.
Hello. What do you mean by go? What do you want me to go with?
Impress us now. We just sit and you just impress us now. Go.
So, it's Sean, that's a terrible thing to do to anyone, just like absolutely instilling that actual fear of God into them. Now, Florence, we're familiar with your book. We were discussing it just briefly off air, but for many of the guys and gals listening today, they may have seen your face pop up on a couple of the Facebook forums over the last couple of years or so, asking for assistance. But tell us a little bit about you first. So who are you, Florence? Who are you?
So I'm a writer and filmmaker. I'm a journalist. I'm not a biologist or a wildlife expert. I'm just someone who's passionate about wildlife and urban wildlife in particular. And I'm especially interested in the places where humans and wildlife meet and interact, which is why I wanted to write a book about urban wildlife. So the book's called Wild City: Encounters with Urban Wildlife. And I wrote most of it during the pandemic, in fact, which was an interesting time. I think everyone was sort of starting to tune in more to the wildlife on their doorstep than they might have before, and to kind of notice all the changes that were going on when we were all restricted to our own little patch. We had 1 hour a day to walk in. So we had that lovely weather as well across a lot of the country. So that was the context in which I was writing. And what I wanted to do with the book was to show people, kind of the richness and the diversity of wildlife that you can get in urban areas, because people quite often discount it. And I believe that the only way that we can get people to care about it is to know that it's there in the first place, be interested in it, and then want to encourage and protect it and create habitats for it. So that was why I wanted to write the book. I guess it's interesting because I think when a lot of people think of urban wildlife, they do just think of quote unquote pests. But as I'm sure you are all aware, or will be the first to point out, a pest is just an animal that's out of place. And who decides what its place is? We do. So, so I wanted to look at the species that people are familiar with and might expect to find in urban environments, like foxes or pigeons or grey squirrels, and get people to look a little bit differently at those and think about why those species might be interesting. And then also look at the more unusual things that people don't expect to find in urban environments, everything from peregrine falcons to great crested newts to water voles. Initially, so the way that the book is structured, it's divided up. So it starts up above in the sky, moves down. I've got an island life chapter, which is everything from sort of Richmond Park through to a tree pit. So islands surrounded by a sea of tarmac. There's an aquatic chapter, and it ends in the underworld, as I call it. So kind of going down. Initially, I wanted to start it down and going up, and my publisher said to me, Florence, I love your enthusiasm for rats, but I think we need to take people on a journey. So how about we start with the birds and then move all the way down before we start trying to tell people that they should be interested in rats. So that's what I did.
That's amazing. And I love the sort of like the drive of this book, because we probably will all remember those amazing pictures that came out during COVID with all of the deer sort of like, was it, they moved out of Richmond and they started to move sort of like further across into, we're having them walking down streets. All of the canals in Venice cleared up, didn't they? Because they didn't have the silt being turned up, and people were amazed to see that there was fish in the canals of Venice. And all of the smog over Tokyo disappeared, and we started to see the birds. So it was really quite a, as you say, it was a really like weird time, wasn't it? When we were suddenly aware of how much wildlife is immediately on our doorstep, even in areas where we consider it to be relatively sterile, like in the middle of city centres. And we as the pest management community definitely can attest to that, because a lot of the ones that became a lot more visible were ones that were very pertinent to us at the end of the day. So it was quite good fun. How did you find that, Sean? You know, did you notice anything like that where you were?
Just listening to you two talk, I find it odd. So like, and I get it, like a lot of people don't know it's there, but the way I was brought up, we were very in tune. I was very in tune with it throughout all of my childhood. We were brought up on like the urban fringe, so I could go however many 100, 200 yards, and I was out into fields. I could go 100, 200 yards, and I was always the kid that was hunting, shooting, fishing. Like my life sort of revolved around it. So when I hear that someone doesn't know it's there, but then the reality that 99.9% of the world doesn't know it's there, I find it like absolutely mind-boggling that like people didn't know there was fish in the canals of Venice, because I know they'll be everywhere. Do you know what I mean? That they didn't know that there was deer in these areas, because you get up at 3 o'clock in the morning at dusk and take your dog for a walk, you'll see them, they'll be there. You know, they're just good at hiding, aren't they? So I love anything like this. This is like right up my street. I look at like them sort of creatures in a whole different light as to I would have looked at them when I was younger. Like they were very much on the to be chased scale when I was younger, you know. That's what it was. Whereas now it's just nice to see them, isn't it? It's nice to see them, nice to have them.
It's a really interesting point, Sean, because I didn't grow up in London. So right now I live super urban. I live in King's Cross. So you can't get much more urban than that. But I grew up in North Essex, and I guess kind of similar to you, really. I was in a large village or small town outside another town, but it was kind of semi-rural, at least in parts. So I grew up with parents that were really interested in wildlife. So I was kind of, you know, they woke me up in the morning to see, you know, or in the middle of the night to see a family of hedgehogs walking across our lawn, or they, you know, we went at sort of 5 a.m. to hear the nightingale singing, or to go and look for lizards, or to look for tawny owls in the woods. So that was my childhood. But it was interesting when I moved to London, I started having different sorts of experiences with wildlife. So, for example, growing up where I grew up, just outside Colchester, I had never seen a red fox up close in my life. And then I moved to London, and there was one in the bathtub. But you just, So it's a very, very different experience. I'm not even joking. I'd never seen a cormorant with any kind of close distance, and now they're just chilling in front of me on the canal every day, drying their wings. So it's interesting because I suppose you can also, I found it fascinating because you can have a different sort of relationship with wildlife. I went to Richmond Park a couple of weeks ago with a couple of friends who were photographers and filmmakers as well, and I drove us over for sunrise because the deer rut is ongoing at the moment. And there were photographers there in full camo gear, which I find hilarious because they've just driven into the car park, picked up their cappuccino, but they've got their full camo gear as if the deers give a shit. They really don't. They're very much acclimatized to people. I call them semi-wild in my book. They're only half wild. And they'd flown in from, all over Europe because they were like, there's nowhere else where we can get this close. And there they are kind of framing up, trying to take these pictures that look like they've encountered this deer in the middle of the wilderness. If you tried to photograph red deer up in Scotland, you wouldn't get within, I don't know how many meters of them, but there they are taking these photos. And there I am, fascinated, trying to get photos deliberately with the jogger in the background, or I find all of that context really fascinating. I think kind of red deer roaring with car park and cafe behind it is like a more interesting spectacle in a way. But yeah, and it is funny watching how people react to these animals because yes, they are semi-wild, but on the other hand, some people don't realize that they're wild at all. So I've had to kind of get in the way of people literally holding toddlers up for selfies during rutting season by stags. And I'm like, what on earth are you doing? So it's interesting.
I think that's Darwinism in action in two very different streams there. There's the mating competition of the stags, and then there's the self-elimination of a gene line by holding a child up to a rutting, stag. So, no, I've seen those pictures as well. They're mesmerizing and terrifying in equal measures. But no, while we go into this, because I know we've got limited time, but I know your book covered so many different animals, and there's some that definitely I want to dig into. But first things first, other than the rats, obviously, what was your favorite animal to observe and to write about in your book? Which was the one that really captured your heart attention?
Okay, two, and you're right. I do love rats. I do, and I'm very interested in kind of the nuance around that. But we can get into that. But I think it would have to be. Can I have two?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think it would have to be the great crested newts and the water voles, because those are two really iconic species. I really want to represent the amphibians right now because they do not get enough love. So I have to put the great crested newts in there. And in Peterborough, they have this old brickworks that's owned by Froglife now, and it has the largest population of great crested newts probably in the world. They're in Europe for sure, but probably in the world. And the way that I saw them, they actually look quite unassuming because I went with some volunteers doing a survey, and we're just sort of lifting up survey mats, and they look like sort of little question marks kind of curled under there. But obviously, when you see them in the water, they are incredible creatures, and that requires a lot of hard work to go and survey them in the water because you have to do it at night time with torchlight down and these are like really, really steep pools. So I didn't do that, I've got to be honest. But anyway, I've got a lot of affection for newts. I think they're wonderful creatures. I grew up with a massive pond in my garden, and I used to sit and watch it for hours as a child. We had everything, not great cresteds actually, but we had smooth newts and frogs, toads, love toads. So that was one of them. And then the other is the water voles. And I mean, who doesn't love a water vole for starters? They are kind of indisputably adorable creatures. little kind of fluffy face, and they sit there like munching on greens and their little paws. So they're absolutely gorgeous. But the Glasgow ones are just fascinating because they are, this is one of our most endangered mammals, and you can't move for them in this particular area. There's burrows everywhere. You're literally tripping over burrows, but the area is a really kind of, I want it, not even unassuming, like a slightly ugly park that you wouldn't even notice, scrubby park in the middle of these tenement blocks, in an area that the press have really tastefully called Smack City, and there's no water there. There's no water.
So I remember reading about this a little while ago. That little sort of like bit of scrubby park used to be a football pitch, didn't it? Little kids' football pitch, because this has been going on a little while, I understand. Because, of course, they're protected and we can't do anything with them. They started off in one corner, and so the council and they then sort of like, they didn't mow the lawn for sort of like so many meters around the burrow, and then another burrow would appear closer to the fringe of that, so suddenly there was another circle. And over the course of several years, this entire park got given over to the water voles. And I think, as you're about to say, the really interesting thing about these water voles, and I'm going to keep saying the word water, is they're not actually anywhere near water, are they?
No. And so the Glasgow population, the only population of water voles in the UK that live in a non-riparian, non-water habitat. And no one quite knows why. And I find it really interesting because I am obviously interested in human wildlife conflict as well. And what do you do when you've got a sort of rule like you shouldn't mow around them, but they're popping up in people's gardens because nobody anticipated that happening? And then do you tell people not to mow their gardens? Well, that's obviously problematic. And yeah, they're starting to kind of push the council back, so take over sort of public spaces. And people think there's a really interesting quote. I interviewed an academic who's working on them, who was sort of saying, people think that kind of these sort of conservation issues and human wildlife conflicts only happen in the Serengeti, but here you are in Glasgow, having these sort of issues because this is a very rare mammal in this country, but there's loads of them there. So yeah, it's really fascinating. I have to say the only downer was we waited quite a long time to see one, and the first one I saw, I just kind of saw its tail disappearing down the beak of a heron, and then down the heron's throat slid this egg-shaped lump, and it seemed like a kind of impossible conundrum. Like how could it possibly fit within the neck of this heron? It was so narrow, but
isn't it weird that the heron's hunting in a non-water-based area as well, though?
Well, herons are pretty adaptable birds, because they will eat so many different things. And also people used to think of the heron family as, I suppose, a relatively shy family, like they did the rail family. But if you meet an urban coot or an urban heron, they're hard as nails. I was sitting by the canal once and a coot just stomped up to me and started pecking at my boot. I didn't do anything to it. It just took against me.
I don't know why. I thought
herons
stole me purse.
yeah. I mean, you could, yeah. Well, actually, I mean, I don't know. This is a bit of a tangent, but I don't know how much you know about coots, but they are brutal. So yeah, they can be kind of brood parasites, a bit like cuckoos, and yeah, as a result, sometimes the parents, if they think it's related to them suspecting that one of their chicks might be a brood parasite, but sometimes they peck their babies to death. And yeah, it's really, yeah, they're very brutal creatures.
Isn't nature beautiful? Like,
yeah, I mean, this is the thing, but this is, yeah, and this is why I love it in all its messy complexity, and why I find it so interesting what all of you do as well.
I think you've touched on something really interesting there, actually, and it'll be interesting to see what's Sean's reaction to this as well, which is, I think, a lot of the general public, and I think where probably a lot of the, I wouldn't say antagonism, but where the sort of like the disconnect between the general public and the pest management community is is that the general public will see nature, inverted commas, through relatively rose-tinted glasses. They're having a look at sort of like the nature documentaries. They are one step removed. They see that beautiful animal. It looks lovely. They certainly don't see it sort of like gobbling down a protected water vole, or sort of like pecking their babies to death, or brood parasitism, all these other things, because they do not make good TV. They put people off their fish fingers, don't they? And yet the reality is that's actually a large part of what we are confronted with. The very nitty gritty of nature, day in, day out in our jobs. So it's quite interesting to say that. It's really quite refreshing to say that nature is still wonderful. It is still sort of like this magical thing, but we do have to take nature, not just the bit that makes good Sunday evening television.
Well, and also it doesn't help us in terms of conserving and protecting it if we don't, if we don't look at that in the round, because it's important in terms of ecosystems as well. So, I mean, and I think, there is no, I don't agree with everything that happens in pest control, but I'm sure the same is true for a lot of pest controllers as well. There's a lot of nuance within the pest control community too. I was brought up a vegetarian. I've never eaten meat or fish. Like, I'm quite squeamish about the idea of anything being killed, but also I suppose in a funny sort of way that kind of liberates me in the I don't know, it's interesting. I mean, everyone's going to come to this with different biases, aren't they, as well? So and I guess you all encounter that at sort of every end of the scale. I suppose you will encounter people who don't like what you do one bit, but you'll also encounter people who just want to kill everything, and you think it's absolutely wrong and we should learn to live with things a bit better.
I think what a lot of people don't probably fathom is pest management is on the same tipping scale as conservation in many respects. When we do get, and but Sean will attest to this, and others, I think rats are fascinating. I've worked with them for a long time. You'd think that someone who's been working, to the ultimate destruction of, a pest rat for so many years would hold them in contempt. But I actually find them fascinating. I really like them. I've kept pet rats for years. There's a distinction between pet and pest, though. And there's an element of conservation. We are responsible for these unusual numbers through our poor sanitation, through our poor waste, through being in the wrong place. And when there's too many rats, that's when you start to see them getting into ground nesting birds. You start to see them displacing other small mammals. And that's just rats. It happens with all animals. And it's our job to take the place of the apex predators that we also have managed to push out of the UK to try and keep these populations in balance and in check. And it's a bitter pill to swallow that actually pest management shares a lot of common ground with conservation. It's a strange one.
I mean, the RSPB does a lot of pest management on its reserves. They eliminate rats, foxes, etc., etc. So, and I guess on a sort of individual level, I don't like the killing of anything, but equally, I understand that it can be necessary. It can be necessary for conservation. It can be necessary because rats in people's houses can destroy their lives. So I love rats, but if I had them in my house, I would get a pest controller in. However, having said that, I have learned quite a few things through writing this book in particular, actually, and through meeting Bobby Corrigan, meeting Davy Brown as well. So I would go about it in perhaps a more specific way. I would spend the money to make sure that they are never going to come back, because I think it's really wrong that we don't build properly. We invite creatures into our houses and then we kill them, sometimes in horrible ways. I would only want to use snap traps in boxes. I wouldn't want to use poison if I could avoid it. I think that sticky paper that the mice stick to is just like horrendous. I think a lot of the problem though
that's gone.
Oh, thank God for that then. Yeah, I think, but I think actually also that a lot of the problem is that, I imagine within your industry, you have regulations within which you have to work. Actually, a lot of the problem is where people are doing things for themselves, buying things on the internet, not knowing how to use them properly, and causing all kinds of damage. So, but it is interesting when you think of the regulation that you have if you want to work with rats, say in a research lab, versus if you're a pest controller and you want to eliminate rats, versus if you're an individual and you can buy whatever you want and do whatever you want. So
you will have probably gained a lot of fans on this podcast and in the industry by making the distinction between the professional and the general public users there, because yes, they are worlds apart in what's the word I'm looking for? Help me out here, Sean. Just the attitudes to which pests are controlled. You tend to see some of the worst practice or the most terrifying sort of like stories come out of people who just consider rats and mice to be vermin. They don't have any respect for the animal. They don't have any respect for the products. They will simply just do whatever they deem necessary, and because it's a verminous animal, whatever you like there. So it is interesting, and we do try and do things right. I would say on the whole, the industry tries to do best by the animals, the products, and the applications of them.
I mean, I think the elimination of suffering. I'm reading a really interesting book at the moment. I think all of you would really enjoy. I think it's called Cull of the Wild. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's written by a guy called Hugh something or other, but he's a hedgehog expert. But the book is all about culling for conservation reasons, and he's come in, probably with a similar sort of mindset to me, wildlife lover, kind of lifelong vegetarian, all that kind of thing. But it's really, really interesting because he totally sees the nuance of it. And one point that he made as well, which I found really interesting, was that actually, like, if you do a kind of slow cull, and I guess this would be the case, say, if somebody's got a rat infestation and you don't get them all straight away, or you don't find the source and block it up, you're actually resulting in so many more animals being killed, because then over time they'll breed more, create more, and you're killing more. So that was an interesting point that I picked up on recently as well. But that book, I think, would be super interesting to everyone here. I can see a couple of questions in the chat, by the way, and comments.
I think
Hugh says
that
sticky boards have gone for us but not for the public, so maybe that's something I need to start campaigning and lobbying on. And Andrew,
I think before you move past that, just to touch on that, to give you a bit of context. So there was a bill brought through a couple of years ago, which then got enacted in England, Scotland and Wales, which was the Glue Board Offences Act. Now that has now been fully enacted. So glue boards aren't illegal, so to speak. The sale of glue boards isn't illegal, but the use of glue boards without a license is illegal. So if you want to use a glue board, you need to apply for a license, either a class or an individual license from Natural England. So pest managers, to all intents and purposes, if you don't apply for a license, which are incredibly prohibitive and at the same time expensive, they are, to all intents and purposes, not suitable products for use for the average pest manager. But because it's very difficult to ban the sale of something, it's easy to ban the use of something, but it's very difficult to ban the sale of something, especially across 3 devolved nations. The problem being there that they are still available online and in corner shops, where the sale of them is not illegal, the use of them is. But the general public does not know that the use of them is illegal, and so there we go. But the really upsetting part of this is part of that legislation says that a pest manager or competent person arriving on site, seeing that glue boards are being used out of license, is then responsible for that site and those boards, which leaves us in a sticky situation. Which
literally
is, what do we do? Yeah. We can either report the person, which is sometimes dangerous and awkward. We can try and remove the boards, but that technically is criminal theft. They're not our boards. So where do we stand with that? We can't remove the boards, but we're responsible for the site because we're the competent person.
You definitely can remove them, because theft is to dishonestly appropriate property. So if you're not dishonest in your appropriation of it, you get away with it. The question is, why are we the police? Do you know what I mean? Why are we? We're not. Yeah, rubbish in it.
It is. It was legislation with good intentions, but as Hugh says, it's ended up being relatively bad off the back of that. So, and that's just another example, as we say, that split, or should I say, schism, chasm between the general public and the professional pest manager. And you'll notice that we say well, I say pest managers, because there is a world of difference between pest management, which is avoiding pests in the first place. It's environmental, it is procedural, it is behavioral aspects of society. Pest management, the responsibility of all, and pest control, which is that very pointy end of the stick, that's fatal endpoint, that I believe should realistically be done by professionals only, because it lowers suffering, and it's basically better for the welfare of that animal and for the environment as a whole. But that's just me. But you just brought up Andy's question. I'll bring it up again because I think this is a really good one, because you touched on this a little bit, and I think there's some really good conversation to be had around this.
Wow. Is there too much consideration for wildlife in urban planning or not enough? I mean, it's probably no surprise to anyone here that I'm going to say not enough. There are a couple of points in my book where I got very angry with Boris Johnson in particular. He likes to come after the great crested newts as some kind of but usually that's a dog whistle for people who don't like kind of environmental protections at all. I mean, I'm not kind of an expert. I wouldn't profess to be an expert in urban planning, but there are kind of certain things that I think would be quite easy to institute that we could do that would help a large amount. So, you know, just things like there's a woman who's running a campaign at the moment to get Swift bricks made compulsory in all new builds. That would be so easy. It costs very little. Like, the public are massively in favour. That kind of thing. You could also sort of legislate for so-called hedgehog highways and fences. I would massively incentivise and encourage the use of green roofs. I've got a green roof on my extension that we had put in. So I think there's various things like that. But yeah, I mean, it's difficult. We have a housing crisis and we need to build. So I do appreciate that. But I think that there is quite a lot that we could be doing to improve things for wildlife and create new habitats as part and parcel of that. But then the other problem is that even when there is legislation in place, often it just sort of doesn't happen. So, you know, there's a couple that I interviewed and went to see when I was researching the book that called themselves I think they called themselves the Wildlife Gardeners of Haggerston or something. And they live in this area called the Kingsland Basin, which is a bit off the canal in Hackney. And they bought a new build flat there, and they found that in the contract to build those flats, the housing developers had agreed that they'd do all this rewilding work in that bit of the canal, and they just didn't do it. And nobody checked, and they would have got away with it, except that I think one of these couples went and did an MA in some related subject, and then took them to task and managed to get some money out of it, but then actually did the rewilding work themselves. But the point is that, you know, the legislation is all well and good as well, but it's the implementation is an issue too. Yeah, I agree with you, Hugh. A lot of new build houses and flats are terribly built. I lived in a new build flat overlooking the canal, and our balcony fell into it, and it was less than 10 years old. So yeah, I'm with you. It is a problem. We should legislate for that too. We should build, but I'm sure you will agree with that too, that we should do a better job of building in the first place, because that is going to, you know, not that I want to put you all out of business, but, you know, we're not going to have to kill as many animals if we actually build better and we don't stuff up plastic piping with sandbags and cut all these stupid corners, and probably stop putting decking everywhere and doing mad things that are just going to encourage it and exacerbate it.
There is always going to be three things in life: life, death, and death, taxes, and pests. Okay, I don't think we'll ever be out of a job. But that's not to say that we shouldn't make our lives easier, as you say. And I don't disagree. I mean, there needs to be more provisions for wildlife in the future proofing of our society. But that comes in two formats. And I'll let, I think Sean's desperate to ask Billy's question in a second, but I'll just quickly just pose this one, which is, if we make more provisions for wildlife without fixing the existing issues of sanitation, waste management, then we stop producing areas for wildlife and simply just create refuge for pests. And the problem goes the other way. We haven't created a sanctuary, we've created a tipping ground. So it's going to require more than just the buildings to be designed in such a way to allow for, birds to nest. It's going to require a whole paradigm shift of society to make sure that we're not just making a situation which is already pretty bad exceptionally worse. But again, that's just my opinion on it. It's a good idea, but we need to make sure that it's one of these good ideas with a practical execution to it too. Sean, do you want to read out Billy's question, because it's a really good one?
Is it my turn now? Right, Billy asked a question. I'm sitting dwelling on it because I find it quite interesting that, like, I don't want to sound rude when I say this, you're like at one end of the spectrum from when I was a kid, and I would have been at the total other. And cats were a massive thing. So you've got people keeping cats and the mindset around cats, and then the damage they do to their local populations. But then what happens when they become feral? Did you ever see feral cats turning up or not, or the damage that they come up with?
Okay, so I have a cat.
Yeah.
She was a house cat. She now goes into our garden, but she's an elderly Persian who thankfully has never killed anything other than the odd spider, which is a relief to me because I would find that really upsetting and hard to handle. And yeah, I mean, and I grew up with a few cats as well. Amongst other things, I had a sort of slightly Dr. Dolittle upbringing. We had rats, mice, dogs, cats, guinea pigs, giant rabbits, parrot, you name it. But I think it's a real problem, and I think actually is not perhaps one that we don't address enough, and it's really, really interesting. Because people love their cats, but they do cause a lot of damage. They also shit everywhere, including in my front garden repeatedly, which drives me mad. And apparently everyone has to be okay with that. If my dog creates a mess, I pick up after her, obviously, but people don't do that with their cats. They can't because they roam. They also, I think, are quite often responsible for things people blame other species for. So, I was speaking to a fox expert recently who was saying when people say that foxes are raiding their bins, obviously, quite often it might be true, but, do people ever consider that it might be a cat? Because it also often is. So, I feel like cats do get away with an awful lot. Maybe I've grown slightly biased against them, I should add, because mine is a complete psychopath. She is absolutely awful. She's so bad-tempered. And, she had me in with the GPs once and on a quite heavy dose of antibiotics after she attacked me. So I don't know if I'd have another one, although I am kind of, we've spent a lot of time together now, so we're in it for the long haul. But yeah, I mean, and I don't really have a solution to it because I don't think that we should tell people they can't keep cats. At the very least, I'd like people to put bells on them. I'm not sure that it makes a lot of difference, but I think it makes a bit of difference. Mine has a bell on her. Might give some things a little bit of warning. But yeah, I wish people would be a little bit more mindful, actually, because if you bring your cat in at night, that does eliminate quite a lot of the problem. So people can have cats and make a difference. But yeah, I don't have a solution for it.
Did you know that the number one threat, so the Scottish wildcat is one of the most endangered creatures in the world. I'm sure you and most people are aware. It's more endangered than the giant panda. And the number one threat to the Scottish wildcat is feral cats.
Mm.
I don't think that
Why is that then?
Well, they don't think that there is a genetically pure wildcat left in Scotland now because they're just out. What's happening is that sprawl from the cities has went out, and there's that many feral cats that they interbreed with them. One of my friends got into a lot of trouble, and this is the old RSPB thing. You can kill the cats if they're killing the birds that the RSPB love, but you can't kill them if it's not in their thing. So he's a gamekeeper. He shot a couple of cats as well, killing birds, and they were going to take him to court. And their initial assumption, or the police and the RSPCA's initial assumption was that they couldn't determine the percentage of Scottish wildcat in it, and they wanted to run a court case against them, and they were hopefully going to try and work out what percentage of Scottish wildcat you needed in it before you could be prosecuted for it. And they went to the Scottish Wildcat Association, and they turned around and said, we want them all dead. Every single last one. If it's not 100% pure, we want them gone, because we are literally on, like, we think the only pure Scottish wildcats we've got left are in pens that we're looking after and breeding. And that's just because of our sprawl going out into the rural environment. So so we think about it on this micro basis, don't we? But we never realise how far that problem's actually spreading, do we?
It is really, really interesting. I mean, these issues are complex, and they're hard to grapple with. I mean, kind of one other thought on cats, actually. I find it. Do you remember when that footballer kicked a cat and like everyone went mad, or cat bin lady? You know, like how outraged the public were about that. I do find it interesting, kind of when you think about. And obviously there's so many reasons we could get into, sort of cultural and like the role that they play in our lives, etc. But it is interesting how different people's views are on how we should treat a cat versus another like intelligent mammal, e.g. the rat. And again, this isn't me coming in and saying you shouldn't kill rats if you've got a rat problem, but you know, the fact that people don't care how they're killed, for example, but they absolutely lose it over someone kicking a cat. I mean, you know, he was an arsehole. He shouldn't have kicked the cat. Don't get me wrong. I don't want people kicking cats either, but it is interesting.
We definitely do, don't we? And it can go full circle, can't it? Because now we're in a position where people go, oh, leave the grey squirrels alone. Leave them alone. They're so cute, because they look cute. But they're wiping out reds as they go, and reds are getting battered left, right, and centre. And then the same applies. We put our own individual, what our eyes see, into our decision making, don't we? But you're absolutely right. What a neuter, whatever, they all have or should have the same sort of level playing field, but they definitely do not, do they? And we definitely allow that to change our mindset and how we deal with stuff. I guess we are lucky in that most people are repulsed by rats.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, just to pick you up on the grey squirrel, though, because I have a slightly different view on that, which is that, yes, you know, they are really problematic for reds and out competing them, and have done, but now really only in certain areas. So, for example, grey squirrels in London are not out competing red squirrels, and they are, you know, we're not going to get red squirrels back in London, and the genie is out of the bottle, as it were. So, you know, I would say there's like a little bit of nuance to that. And I actually find the grey squirrel, I find the legislation around grey squirrels really, really strange, actually, because I don't understand why, if someone captures an injured grey squirrel in London, they have to dispatch it. But if they capture an injured brown rat, they're allowed to rehab it and set it free. There's some slightly weird inconsistencies for me there. I also think like some well-meaning person who happens to rehab a grey squirrel and release it is not going to make any difference to the population size. That's not me saying that pest control isn't required with them. That's not me saying that in areas like, so I went to see one of the only populations of urban red squirrels. There's only 2 in the UK. One of them is in Formby, which is a town near Liverpool. The other is up in Scotland. I think it's Inverness. But yeah, around there, yeah, of course they have to control the greys and push them back and protect the reds at all costs. But I don't think that argument holds water where I live, for example.
But if every red squirrel is being removed in London and all we've got's greys, and across most of the country, and that sprawl is going out, I don't understand how we are saying that. So are you saying that we admit defeat and just say we'll put in a boundary at that line and then try to defend that line, if that makes sense,
yes,
rather than try to kill them in other areas?
Correct. Yeah. And that is the only thing that is proven to work in this kind of scale. This is not a case of trying to remove goats from an island in Galapagos, or trying to remove rats from an island in New Zealand where it's very, very costly, but it might be possible. Like, that is just not an option. So yes, that is what I'm saying, that we have to kind of, try and create those boundaries and push back. So I don't think that legislation makes a whole lot of sense personally.
Would you not then just be admitting defeat for the whole of the red squirrel population as it just gets pushed back? No,
you have to defend those boundary lines and push the greys back around those areas. But it's not going to make a jot of difference in terms of the conservation of the remaining reds, eliminating a load of greys around here.
Do you think it would make a difference in terms of public opinion? So imagine you've got the people who are fighting the good fight up on the border, but then you've got people, if you've got the vast majority of your major cities who are saying, listen, the fight's over, give up. Do you think that you could lose your public opinion against the people who are potentially doing the right thing on the borders there, though, if we are not looking at them as a species rather than as a species in individual areas? That would be my worry and concern with just saying, listen, we're giving up with the South. It's done. I
mean, we'd just be killing for the sake of killing, which I don't think anyone's here for. I also think it's kind of nuanced in that, and some people like grey squirrels, others don't. Almost everyone likes red squirrels, but in an urban environment, often grey squirrels are the only mammal that an urban child ever kind of has any kind of connection with, and that helps them build other connections with wildlife and nature. So I see it kind of, I think it's quite nuanced. So you don't just see kind of greys are, sure, they're an introduced, or if you want to say invasive species, but they're also quite a vital connection point. So and I I don't know if I'm contradicting myself here, but sometimes I also sometimes think that as humans and ecosystem engineers, we have caused so much damage, and we have wiped so many species off the map as it is, that how much does it help persecuting those species that actually have managed to carve out a niche and succeed? So and also these things kind of come back around. So like red kites, for example, really successful reintroduction program. They're now actually providing a problem for certain wading birds. So now it's like, should we start controlling the number of red kites? So, from having been a species that like people were delighted to have back and really excited about, it's now flipped to, actually, are they now a pest. So I think these basically, I don't have massively strong views either way on the grey red debate. I just think it's really complicated and nuanced. No, I know I'm not of the opinion that we don't have invasive species. We do definitely have invasive species.
I think for anybody watching this who doesn't know about greys, the greys don't necessarily outcompete the reds. What happens is they carry a pox, which doesn't affect the greys, it affects the reds. So when the greys move in, even in small numbers, they basically give them a disease, and the reds die a fucking horrible death. The only way I can describe it is that the reds almost look like they go through a myxomatosis type symptom, pussy red, inflamed eyes, withered bodies. It really does knock them for six, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah. So that's why the greys are so good at outcompeting them. They don't like fight with them or take the land off them or what have you. It is that squirrel pox which rolls them over and allows them to sort of, and as they colonize and move, the more pox goes and the more the reds die, don't they? That's what happens.
Yeah, it's horrible. There's some really interesting questions, by the way, in the comments. I'm just scrolling.
I was about to say we've got about 10 minutes before we need to get onto our last sort of like our last question. So rather than us pick a question out here, how about you just have a bit of a scroll through and just find one of these questions from our listeners and that's really resonating with you, because there's definitely, I've been watching them coming as well, there's definitely some really good ones in there, so pick your fave.
Okay, so just a quick one. Niall's asking about my opinion on urban beekeeping. Those hipsters love their beekeeping, but Niall, you're completely right, that actually it can have a really negative impact on our natural pollinators, and people think, beekeeping, what a great hobby that would be, and we can put beehives on the roof and that would be an ecologically great thing to do, but actually honeybees will outcompete our solitary bees that are dying out, bumblebees, and if you're just putting a hive up there and you're not doing tons of planting around it to kind of increase the number of flowers and wildflowers around, actually you're probably having a more detrimental effect while feeling good about yourself. So completely agree now. And then Hugh asks, how do you feel about the growing call from some people to just live with rats and other pests? I find it really interesting. I think we culturally, and I haven't looked into this enough, maybe you all know a bit more and might enlighten me, but I think in some cultures people are more comfortable with living with pests and living alongside them, and I do think in certain circumstances, so I wrote this piece recently for the Eye about urban foxes, and people viewing them as pests, and really my personal conclusion to that, and I know some here will disagree, is that we should for the most part get used to living with foxes, because if people's problems are they leave a turd in my garden, I'm sorry, deal with it. So do the cats. If their problem is they raid my bin, again, you sure it's the foxes, and have you secured your bin properly? Is your problem they make a bit of noise when they're mating? Because people have been letting fireworks off at 4 a.m. on random nights around me, and they seem to get away with that. So in some cases, to me, it personally, it's quite a clear one. On rats, I think it's really problematic, and I think I know from writing this book and from doing research, and even talking to friends, that rats can absolutely destroy people's lives. So I don't think asking or expecting people to live with rats is reasonable or fair. So depends on the pest, depends on the circumstances. It's complicated.
Oh, that absolutely is complicated. I think you've hit the nail on the head there. There's the thing that makes an animal a pest is, not all rats are pests. Not and there's no one animal on the planet necessarily, or which is exclusively a pest. It is the situations that we find them in, the spreading of disease, the causing of damage, the distress, which is psychological damage at that point. And it's only those animals realistically that we want to deal with. And you're right, around the world, many different cultures have different, what we say, tolerances for pests. But I don't know of many globally that will fully accept things like rats to live, with the exception of a couple of spiritual temples where they're considered to be holy animals. Generally speaking, in urban environments, the pressure of disease and the pressure caused by damage onto a population of people is untenable. And so living beside them, no, I don't think that is a solution that will ever be workable unless there is some radical changes in society and our behavior towards waste and, again, sanitation and how we structure our buildings.
I think some people go over the top as well, right? So my neighbour at the back of his garden set up a trap to catch mice. He had no mice in his house, never hasn't had a problem with it. And also, one of the maddest parts is that it was a so-called humane trap. So he was then just like moving them elsewhere, which, as you all know, often results in them having a horrible, slow and painful, like death, starving. I mean, maybe not, depends where he's moving them to around us. But anyway, it just struck me as a very pointless thing to be doing, because there's always going to be mice around the back of the alleyway and the back of your garden, and catching them and moving them on, not even that far, when they're not actually causing you any problem, just seems like a waste of everybody's time and energy. But maybe that's just me.
I always think that the call for us to live with rats is from the people who do not currently have a rat problem.
Yes.
As a pest manager, we see it every day. It's like, you're not killing the rats, are you? You are horrible. I do not want you. This is disgusting. And then they've got rats in the loft and they're like, kill them now, get them out of my house. But I'm sure there's something ingrained within us, because they spread disease, that makes us want to not be there. Because it's not like you don't get if all they're hearing is noises in the loft. If it's a bird, they can tolerate it. If it's a squirrel, they can tolerate it till it chews through the water pipe. If they think it's a rat, they want it out. There is definitely something, I don't know what's the right word, Al, where it's like ingrained into you, comes from ages ago.
Oh, I know exactly the word you're talking about, and you put me on the spot now. It's inherent.
Inherent, yeah. It's inherent within us that we do not want rats around us. And is it true that fear of rats is the most common phobia in the world? Should I Google that?
I don't know
right?
for certain, but I mean, I probably would say fear of drowning, fire, and falling, but with animals, probably rats, yes, because if nothing else, they're probably the most ubiquitous animal around the world in terms of human contact. So it would make sense.
The question, I think there's probably, the question is it hardwired, or is it something that we pass down as well? Because phobias are an interesting thing, right? My mum had zero fear of pretty much any animal, and would pick up giant spiders in her bare hands, and was very careful as well not to put any kind of fear towards me. But my dad, he does not like spiders, so he would be around them. I don't mind spiders. There was a huge one in the corner of my living room last night, which my dad was round and did not like the look of. And I was like, that's fine. It's up there. I can handle that. But if that was in my bedroom, wouldn't like it. I would be getting a glass and trapping it and popping it out the window, which I could just about manage, but could not pick that up with my hands. So it is interesting, but you definitely pick it up from others as well. And likewise, I'm sure sort of me having Bruce, my pet rat, as a child, has resulted in me not being afraid of them, because I was sort of conditioned to, I had one that was a mate. So again, not me saying I want them in my house. I don't, but I'm not afraid of them.
Do you know the one thing about tonight I don't think, I know you're talking about your relationships of urban sort of pests, how similar it is to the relationships that the rural people have with pests is striking. It's absolutely striking, but it's in a whole different environment and the different way that they go about it and the way that the town sees it to the countryside and and we have this disconnect from the people living out in the countryside. You've got the kites was the perfect example, wasn't it? We love seeing them, but like, is it a problem? Like, how do we deal with it? How do we get there?
Some people in urban environments, it's weird. It's like they draw this line like, okay, the wildlife is here in the countryside and I live in the city, which is for people, built by people. And so there's no wildlife here. And if there is, whatever it is, we need to remove it, sanitize it, get it out, get it away from me. If I want wildlife, I'll go to the countryside for the day, which is ridiculous because obviously wildlife doesn't see it that way at all. They don't go, oh, look, people have built this city. I don't belong here. If you're a peregrine falcon, you don't go, oh, there's a tower block. You go, there's a brilliant cliff. I'm going to go find myself a nice nest nice ledge to nest in, and get me some pigeons to eat. This is pretty ideal. So it's it is a funny one. But then there is also a lot of love for wildlife in urban environments, and a lot of people doing a lot of amazing work. And actually, that was, my book was always going to be as much about people as it was about animals, about wildlife. And I'm someone that likes people. Some people who are really into wildlife, they don't like people. I really like people. I'm interested in people and I'm interested in wildlife. And so the book is as much about people as it is about wildlife. And I met some incredible characters that are doing really, really amazing work across the country in towns and cities. So I think that's probably something that I should mention as well, because I feel like we've been talking about kind of the negatives and necessarily kind of the way that people react negatively to pests and wildlife, but there's a lot of amazing work and positives going on too. And we live in quite frightening times in many ways when we're talking about climate change, which, by the way, we haven't even got onto, but will probably have really interesting, maybe not very pleasant implications in terms of pest populations. But yeah, so we live in quite frightening times, and I really wanted to write a book that was positive, and that kind of didn't gloss over or skip over any of these messy realities that we've been talking about, but also looked at a lot of the amazing work people have been doing. Although we're, deeply nature depleted, a lot of the species that are still there that you can see that people don't know are there. So I just feel like that's probably an important point to make. Oh, thank you so much, Hugh. He says the book's most certainly worth reading. That's really kind. Thank you.
Just to remind everyone, what's the name of the book? Just so everyone can scribble it down. Hold up a copy of it.
Wild City: Encounters with Urban Wildlife, and I'm Florence Wilkinson, and it's out in paperback now.
Do you know, Florence? I think everyone would agree. I'm not even going to ask people to comment, but I think you're absolutely right. I think we need to learn to live with foxes. We need muntjac deer and deer coming in. We need these things in the urban environments. We've seen it massively with seagulls, like the stronghold, the redback, lessers. Is it lessers and herons, Alex, have just went red listed? I think it's lessers and herons have went red listed a couple of weeks ago. The only place they are living is city centres. Like, if we can't agree to look after them, then there is something terribly wrong. We have to learn that there is a number of things that we need to live with. And like, what damage does you're right. If you can't lock your bin up, it's your own fault. And if you lock your bin up, it's going to scavenge stuff. It's going to pick up dead rats. It's going to pick up dead birds. It's going to clean stuff up. They are a benefit to having them around. They're not. There's a lot of things that I previously would look at as pests and I don't anymore. Stoats, weasels, stuff like that. Like, they should be here. We should be looking after them, shouldn't we?
So I will caveat this with a little devil's advocate here, which is absolutely there's an element of We should tolerate them. We should make accommodations for them. We should understand that the world that we live in is forever evolving and adapting, including our cities. But I also don't believe that we should just be like, hands up, go away, walk away. There should always be a position for the management and conservation of these animals when they become pests. We shouldn't take, we shouldn't necessarily take our foot off the gas, but we might have to realign where that vehicle is heading. Thoughts?
Especially if their numbers in population get so high that it becomes detrimental. So you start seeing massive mange outbreaks in fox and things like that because their numbers get too large. And you have to thin them down for the benefit of the species. You see with myxomatosis, don't you? Rabbit populations go through the roof and then loads of them will die a horrible death. There is that management. And that management, I would like to think, is what we do, isn't it? Al, agree?
Yeah. I do, and it goes back to Florence. You may agree or disagree, but this is the point you made earlier about when you do culls in the wrong way, when you don't manage a population with enough either intensity or efficacy or care, then you end up just cropping, and it's a continual and persistent event, by which you cause a lot more damage to that population in terms of humaneness than you would do if you went in and just did it hard and fast and right the first time, with a knowledge and forethought of what you're doing. And that's where being a professional comes into that, I believe. So, Florence, we've got 10 minutes left. So your final thoughts on this before we hit the big three?
Oh, goodness. I mean, I think that we have a lot of common ground, and I think that people should be having more of these sort of open conversations. And I find everyone's questions and challenges really interesting, actually. I find your whole sector absolutely fascinating. And, I think that there's a lot of complexity, but I love that. And having met quite a few people in this sector, I found them all to be, very thoughtful, open people who are happy to kind of discuss these issues. So yeah, I find it fascinating.
Can I just ask one question? And tell me to go, jump, piss off, get into a well, whatever you like. But before you started writing these, before you started writing these books, honestly, what was your opinion of the pest management sector, and how did that then change after you'd spoken, at random to people within it? Because there was no confirmation bias. It's not like the sector presented you with the fluffiest, cuddliest pest managers. You picked them almost at random from the forums. So honestly, what was it like before, and how did that then change when you actually spoke to us?
I don't actually think I had a particularly strong view, but probably I probably would have thought of it as a job that someone has to do, but why on earth would you want to do it? To be honest. I guess. And, I said, I don't like the killing of anything. So, and brought up vegetarian, etc. So I probably would have had like a slight squeamishness about it. Although I don't know actually, because do I find it that different people kind of, again, I find it odd if people are getting really squeamish about killing rats if it's done in a humane way, but are happy to eat meat in an abattoir that's killed in a really horrible way. So I think there's a lot of contradictions. So actually, maybe in that sense, I wouldn't have seen it kind of that differently from eating meat, which obviously, my husband does. So
Right, let's get you. Well, I'm conscious we'll run out of time. We've got to get it going. So, 3 questions. Have you enjoyed your time on the podcast?
Oh yeah, it's been brilliant. Really interesting.
Awesome.
Oh, excellent. Go on. Do I get to do the next one?
Yeah, you do next one. Go on.
Yeah. Go on then. Give us a shameless plug. If there's one thing that you want all of the pest management community in the UK, and apparently in the States and Canada too, to do one thing tomorrow morning, what would it be?
Obviously, buy my book.
Hey!
Buy my book. And
There we
if you
go.
want real brownie points, buy it from a bookshop. Support your local bookshop.
Definitely
But
could
buy
do
it
that.
online, buy it anywhere. But bookshops the best.
Perfect stuff.
And then the last one, if you could think of someone to come on the podcast that you would like to hear from in this sort of sector or whatever, who would you pick?
Oh, I really think that you should get. Now, I want to look it up in case I'm going to get it wrong, but I think it's Hugh Warwick who wrote the book that I'm reading at the moment, Colour of the Wild, because I think that would be really, really interesting. So I think, that might be a good one. You mentioned gamekeepers as well. I don't want to get into that sort of gnarly area, but I do have some beef with them. So I quite like to, I'd be interested to kind of listen
They're like
into.
all my friends.
Well, there you go, Sean. So I would, I'd be interested in that. Or maybe even if you brought, it would be quite cool to have
come
two
on.
like super opposing people.
All of my friends, a lot of my friends are gamekeepers, and I've asked them and they won't come on because they just don't feel, even when me doing this, they don't feel like they'd get a fair shake. That what they say won't be listened to. That's how they feel. They feel like they are conservationists, that they are looking after it, and they will be kicked. So like they kill fox and crows to protect birds, and they get thrown under the bus by the RSPB, who are killing foxes to protect birds on their estate. And they're like, you can't do it, but we can, because our birds are important and your birds aren't. One of my friends is up in Scotland, and they came onto his estate and they counted everything. The RSPB came on, they counted everything, and they said, you've got 13 of the 15 birds of prey that we would expect to see on your estate. And he said, all right. And they said, well, we think the 2 are missing through predation, like through yous killing them, through illegal killing them. It's like, what? So they then paid for someone to go down on the RSPB's estate, which was like a couple of 100 yards down the road, and they had 4 species of birds of prey on it out of the 15. And they said, oh yeah, but we don't do that. He's like, no, the people from the RSPB estate were coming up to his estate to watch birds of prey and then shooting them in the foot. And they're like, listen, the best thing we can do is just keep our head down, because we won't get a fair shake, and they won't come on and they won't talk. And these are lads I've grown up with since I was 10, 12-year-old who know that I know them inside out. And they feel massively under attack, and they just won't be part of it. And what they've got to offer in terms of trapping, in terms of conservation, everything that they do is brilliant, but they are so vilified that they just won't do it, but it is what it is. But I promise you, Florence, if I can get one on, I'll get one on, and I will let you know they're going to be on, and maybe you could come on with them.
Yeah, well, actually, there'd probably be someone better placed that knows more about that than I do, because it's not something I've looked into in depth, because I obviously focus on urban, which is very different. But it would be really interesting. They probably wouldn't agree to it, but if you could get two opposing sides on that, because I'd be really interested to hear that. I hear that conversation and hear both sides.
Would be interesting, wouldn't it? Right. Thank you very much.
Good luck. Give it a go.
See if I can do it after 3.
Okay. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
I wouldn't dare
I'll
do
do
it. But thank you very much,
me.
guys. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Beauties and Beasties podcast. Thank you for listening to the Beauty